The war grinds on in the summer of 1917 as American troops prepare to enter the battle. But in the fall of that year, a revolution in Russia creates new opportunities for the Germans.
They defeat Russia in 1918. When Lenin takes power, he sues for peace with Russia, and they sign a peace treaty in March of 1918. So what begins as a war for the Balkans becomes, by the end of 1918, essentially a war of conquest for not just territory in Europe, but also perhaps colonies worldwide.
On the Western Front, European troops continue their four-year struggle, living in a vast network of trenches that etch the French countryside. Muddy, wet, cold, swarming with lice and rats, morale among soldiers on both sides of the conflict is at an all-time low. Before American troops can arrive, German forces launch one last offensive.
In March of 1918, it does what nobody's been able to do for 3 years. It breaks the stalemate. It breaks through. And in a series of 5 offensives throughout the spring of 1918, Germany's gamble is that now we're going to get to Paris. We're going to finish what we started in 1914. And once again, they get to within 30 miles of Paris. You know, 1 million people evacuate Paris. I mean, there's panic. People think this really could be it.
But in June, the first contingent of American forces joins the French.
And those really are the first big battles that America fights at Château-Thierry and at Belleau Wood, and we can credit the Americans with actually stopping that drive to Paris. They stopped the German offensive.
By July, over 1 million American troops flood into Europe. The fervor of war, a battle mentality, can be felt on both sides of the Atlantic. The target at home is anyone suspected of undermining the war effort. The town of Bisbee, Arizona, is a case in point.
It's a town that at the turn of the century was a center of copper mining, where the exploitation of both natural and human resources is going on in a really intense fashion. Then the war comes, and copper is a very valuable commodity. Every bullet requires copper, and so the cost of copper goes through the roof, and the companies are making a fortune. A lot of men are also leaving Bisbee to go to the war, and the workers, in some ways, are operating now from a position of strength.
The miners, most are union members, stage work stoppages, demanding better working conditions and higher pay. Business owners counter by organizing townspeople into what they call a Citizens Protective League.
Worried that the strikers are undermining the war effort, the Citizens Protective League decides to deport the radicals, and they begin at dawn and they announce, all women and children off the streets today. More than 1,000 people went through town and sort of gathered up people, and then they put them on railroad cars. And they shipped the cars out of town and said, we're going to break this union and we're going to get this copper out of the ground again. And this creates a national controversy that brings together all kinds of labor leaders and reformers, people who often wouldn't have been really sympathetic to what the strikers in Bisbee were saying. The government sends a series of investigators to go and investigate the conditions of work and the conditions under which this deportation took place.
The report that is eventually released criticizes the actions of the citizens and mine owners. But by that time, the unions are shut down, and the workers themselves get very little of what they wanted.
And so this, I think, sets the stage for things like the Espionage Act. That's passed in 1917. It's expanded in 1918 with the Sedition Act. And these have significant penalties for people who speak out against the draft or against the war effort.
In Europe, General Pershing, commander of U.S. troops, is fighting a battle of his own.
The Americans have watched what's happened on the Western Front for 3 years, and it's just been mass slaughter. So it really doesn't encourage American generals to feel that the Allies really have a good game plan here. Let's just give them American soldiers to sort of throw at the machine guns. Pershing fights very, very hard, especially with the French, to get his own sector of the Western Front under American command. And that finally happens in September of 1918. One of Wilson's goals of the war is to have a very strong influence on the peace. And the only way that that's going to happen is if the American contribution is clear.
In a carefully coordinated effort, the Allies launch a major attack on the German position.
Instead of piecemeal attacks, the Allies are going to converge in 4 separate attacks on the Western Front, all simultaneously to push Germany back once and for all. It's some of the hardest fighting of the war. And when Pershing gets criticized, why are the Americans all bogged down where, the French and British armies are making all this progress along other parts of the front? Pershing argues, I think correctly, that he's fighting in an area that Germany's had for 4 years. It's wooded, it's high terrain, it's completely entrenched. And in that heavy fighting that he's doing, Germany's draining off divisions from other parts of the front, making it possible for the French and British to push forward.
This is one of the rare moments in the war when black troops are engaged in something more than manual labor.
African American soldiers were largely relegated to service units where they were asked to sort of provide manual labor, ditch digging, and so forth. Many of them were not given the kind of military training that they needed to be effective in combat. And those who ended up in combat, for example, in the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne, faced some really difficult situations without the kind of training that they needed.
A lot of people look at the American effort during the First World War and say, well, we hardly fought at all. We were only in there a year and a half, 6 months of combat. I mean, look at what happened to Germany and to the Allies. But during the Meuse-Argonne campaign, which is a 47-day campaign at the end of the war, 6,000 Americans are dying a week. I mean, now, if 10 Americans die a day in a military conflict, it really is a scandal.
Despite heavy Allied losses, German forces are pushed back to their own border. Supply lines are cut.
They're exhausted. They have nothing left. And all they can see now is the Allies are pushing forward and more American troops are going to be coming. So finally, they realize that the war is lost.
Rather than have their country invaded, German military leaders seek an armistice, an immediate ceasefire that will give the warring parties time to sit down and talk. Almost a year earlier, Wilson had presented his plan for a just peace.
When Wilson described why the United States was fighting, one of the slogans he developed was that the United States was fighting this war to end all wars. He said that the United States was fighting to make the world safe for democracy.
When Lenin takes over, he makes public secret treaties, and that basically shows that while the Allies claimed that they were fighting a war for right and democracy and human freedom, that behind closed doors they had negotiated these territorial exchanges of what they were going to gain when they won. And so this just seemed like, they're just fighting a war of conquest just like Germany is, so what's the difference? And Lenin challenges the world to make its war aims clear, and Wilson steps up with the 14 points.
14 different headings of how the world should be reordered after the war to create what he called a peace without victory. And what he meant by that was that the world after the war would differ from the world before by ending these secret alliances, these secret treaties. He thought that the war had been so devastating to the participants in Europe that now they would be willing to end this kind of greed that had led to the war.
And history since then has been a contest over whose vision would win out, a realist view of that nations are basically bad and that they will fight each other, and you just got to build up your strength as much as you can and deal with others that way from a position of strength, or that nations are capable of cooperating.
That is, everyone looking out for everyone else's interest through a general international organization, an organization which came to be called the League of Nations. That was the centerpiece of Wilson's program.
That's Wilsonianism, or liberal internationalism, based on an arbiter, on an organization that could lift itself outside the realm of nations and alliances and make policy decisions, or at least assess and judge and hand down decisions on which nation was right or wrong in a conflict.
Even when the 14 points were first issued, Britain and France were not supportive.
They're not fighting for just high principles. They are fighting to defeat Germany, and they want a peace of vengeance against Germany, and they're fighting for territory. They expect German colonies to be transferred to them when the war is over, and they expect Germany to pay. So Wilson issues the 14 points. Clemenceau doesn't even read them. until Germany sues for an armistice based on them. And so right there, we're seeing the foundation for problems that will become clearer when the peace is actually being negotiated.
When President Wilson arrives in Paris for peace talks, he is cheered by one of the largest crowds in French history. His intent, his purpose, is to shape the contours of the post-war era.
It turns out he can't because those realists, the French and the British, say, sure, we'll join the League of Nations, but the British say, we want our big navy. And the French say, we want to lop off part of Germany, and we want the Germans to be responsible for this war, and they're going to have to pay us billions of dollars. And Wilson says, okay, as long as I have my League of Nations. So from that point on, Wilson's vision clashes with the hard realities of international politics.
Wilson's critics said that he compromised too much, that the peace treaty that emerged from the Paris Peace Conference was not a peace without victors, that it was a peace that punished Germany. He compromised on the territorial settlement in the Far East. He compromised on the territorial settlement in Poland. All of these compromises he made so that the other nations would agree to the creation of the League of Nations.
Nobody gets really what they want. The French, or Clemenceau, wants a defensive security arrangement that will protect France in the future. Britain wants Germany to pay, but is a little bit more nervous about the idea of totally weakening Germany because this is going to create a huge power vacuum in the center of Europe, and who's going to fill that? And of course, Wilson gets the least of what he wants. Wilson wants the 14 points enacted. He gets self-determination. Self-determination, in Wilson's mind, really was essentially an idea that he only really meant to apply to Europe.
But its greatest impact was in the non-Western world. So as a result, he formed enormous interest in national self-determination in 1919 in Egypt, for example, in China, and in Korea. Actually, things threatened to get out of hand for the colonial powers in all of those areas.
So in a sense, Wilson opens up a Pandora's box of encouraging these nationalists, those who had not dared to speak up against colonial regimes now felt that they had the support of the United States.
Wilson wasn't too enthused about that, and when it actually came to the point of Egyptians asking him to support their cause, he said, no, thank you, I don't want to do that. But ideologically, the mere fact that he's announcing national self-determination as a major goal, I think, is very important.
As he returns from France, Wilson is well aware of the political obstacles waiting for him at home.
The Senate of the United States was now in the hands of the Republican Party, Wilson's political adversaries, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, chaired by Henry Cabot Lodge, a man who absolutely despised Wilson, rejected the treaty.
Conservatives ask, well, what does collective security mean? Is that going to mean that if we join the League of Nations and Britain gets attacked, that the League is going to have the ability to say America must send troops over in order to protect Britain? It's Congress that has this power. Are we giving that power, giving control of our armies to an international organization? For liberals, their problem with collective security is a little bit different, which is, well, won't this just prop up the empires that we're criticizing around the world?
Wilson would compromise quite a bit at Paris with the other leaders of the great powers in order to get the League of Nations. He wouldn't compromise with the Senate. He wouldn't allow the Senate of the United States to include certain reservations that the United States would reserve the right to decide whether it would deploy its troops. Wilson's Democratic senators begged him to allow that kind of reservation, but he wouldn't.
He goes on this speaking tour. He's going to drum up public support, sort of put pressure on Congress to show them the country is really behind this idea of a League of Nations and make them answer to the American people. He has rousing receptions, gives beautiful speeches. He's giving this speech in Pueblo, brings tears to people's eyes, and at the end of it, he becomes incredibly nauseated, starts twitching, and his doctor is afraid that he's about to have a heart attack right there, rushes him back to Washington, where he in fact suffers a stroke several days later. And this, of course, is critical because from this point on, Woodrow Wilson is out of the picture.
He wasn't in command. His wife really took over as acting president. She wasn't called that, but she was the president in everything but name.
Nobody's really sure who's running the country. And people are kind of mystified. I mean, Wilson is said to have recovered, resting comfortably, but he just disappears.
And the two of them together, Wilson and his wife Edith, came to see conspiracies all around him. And one of the conspiracies they thought was at work was that these Democratic senators who begged Wilson to allow reservations to be included in the final treaty were conspiring to undermine his work.
And then, of course, the end of the story is somewhat tragic for him because the Senate does, in fact, vote down the treaty 3 times. And so when he leaves office, the United States has not ratified the treaty, never joins the League of Nations.
But to some historians, the legacy of Wilson's vision does not end as abruptly as it seems.
There's a view which many people have that somehow or other Wilson was rejected, that some kind of more traditionalist orientation returned to American foreign policy. But I think in many ways the U.S. does carry out some aspects of Wilsonianism. For example, Wilson emphasized disarmament, the idea that the nation should not be spending so much on their armed forces because that would only invite more war, but that they should be willing to scrap their ships and guns and so on to devote their energies to peaceful pursuits.
I think you can clearly see the seeds of the next war being sown in the Versailles Treaty. First of all, just the clause of war guilt. The British and French insist on that Germany will never accept. Germany does not believe that it alone caused the war, and I think that events, in fact, prove them right.
Germany refuses to accept responsibility for the reparations the Allies are demanding.
In fact, they had been the first to demand reparation payments of the Russians in 1918 when it looked like they were going to be winning the war. And also the Germans had, in fact, destroyed, often maliciously, as they were retreating, lots of French industry and coal fields and property. So it certainly seemed as if some reparation payments were in order. Secondly, the Versailles Treaty creates new countries in Eastern Europe that are unstable. In some of those countries, like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Austria, there are German minority populations who would rather be part of Germany. Third, the Versailles Treaty divides the Allies in the post-war world. They may have been more united in their reaction to Hitler if they hadn't really had 20 years of divisions over the first peace settlement. It seems clear that World War II is World War II for a reason. This is not a peace treaty, this is a 20-year truce. They expect another war.
Even during the Paris Peace Conference, many Americans are more concerned about the turbulent events at home than they are about international negotiations.
You have an immediate post-war recession once war industries lose their government contracts. You have strikes, race riots. It's an incredibly unsettled, turbulent time. This is the environment into which 4 million men come home and start looking for jobs and got $60 in their pocket as a bonus. And there was tremendous dissatisfaction with how they were welcomed home.
The fact that black soldiers fought in the war has almost no impact on white attitudes, but it does have a profound effect on how blacks feel.
Suddenly they're a veteran. And that's a new social category, and it means something very distinct in American history. And for World War I veterans, like other generations before and after them, they found their cause.
Nationwide, there are a series of race riots, including in the urban north. There's also physical violence targeted against African Americans. In the year 1919, perhaps as many as 70 African Americans were lynched in a single year. There are stories of African-American soldiers being lynched while wearing their uniforms. Again, one of the tragic ironies of the 20th century. But it also, I think, shows what a threatening symbol, a strong African-American soldier in a U.S. military uniform would have been to a lot of people in the white South at this time.
At the end of the war, a number of people become obsessed with purging the country of radicals.
You had this sort of explosion of pure American patriotism in 1919. You have the crackdown on the communists and the first real major American Red Scare in 1919. You have a crackdown on a lot of unions. You have a number of spectacularly violent strikes and strike breaking in that year. And all of this is usually attributed to the intensity of the pro-war propaganda campaign, which sort of had no place to go once the war, which was very brief, was over.
And on top of this, there was the growing power of the Socialist Party in America, which had remarkable gains between 1910 and 1917. The Socialist Party won many, many state and local elections. And so you had this sense that there was a relationship between foreignness, between immigration, and between these radical political ideas of anarchism, socialism, and ultimately communism.
Keep in mind, of course, that this is only 2 years after the Russian Revolution, and the Bolshevik menace of Russia was still very fresh in everyone's minds as a new force in the world. But the Red Scare after World War I did not have very much to do with a fear of the military aims of the Soviet Union. It was much more a fear of domestic subversion and a series of bombings, in fact, that occurred in the United States, in Washington, on Wall Street, and elsewhere, terrified Americans.
Attorney General Palmer and his ambitious assistant, J. Edgar Hoover, orchestrate a series of raids on alleged radical centers, arresting more than 6,000 people.
Without either search warrants or arrest warrants, they had held them in detention for long periods of time without bringing charges against them. They had especially singled out a lot of immigrants, a lot of aliens. The Supreme Court, which in this period was not the most progressive of the courts, at times drew the line or attempted to somewhat moderate this kind of hysteria.
It was really only in some cases that arose out of the Espionage Act in the First World War that the Supreme Court announced that the clear and present danger standard was applicable to freedom of speech. But a point I want to make here is that people went to jail for saying things in the First World War that nobody would have even thought it possible to convict people in the Second World War, during the Korean War, the Vietnam War, of saying those kinds of things. Opposition to the government, opposition to the war, and so on.
Economic problems, labor unrest, racial tensions, and the intensity of anti-radicalism combined to create a general sense of disillusionment.
On the one hand, World War I legitimized a whole range of governmental activities that had not had legitimacy before, and in particular some of the ways in which the government tried to regulate the economy. On the other hand, the war and the aftermath of the war, when for another year or so there was similar social turmoil over many of the same issues, helped to delegitimize some of the repressive and coercive measures that the government had undertaken during World War I, and make it more difficult for the government to move in that direction in the future.
People were just tired. There had been a great deal of ferment for 2 decades to get people involved and to feel socially responsible. And this culminated, of course, in the great moral crusade of the First World War to make the world safe for democracy, and people were tired of that. Warren Harding ran on a campaign of restoring normalcy in 1920, and as you know, that was a word that he had invented. But people knew what he meant, and people were probably glad to have something like normalcy back when Warren Harding became president.
And yet, the legacy of Woodrow Wilson will serve as a reference point for decades to come.
What he did was to provide an historical interpretation, history as art, of the stakes in World War I, what that war meant to the direction of world history, what that war meant to the continued development of the United States, to democracy, to other peoples as well. So the way I describe this to my students is, you've ever seen a Jackson Pollock painting with all the squiggles and squirrels and drips and so on, and you ask yourself, what in the world does that mean? And then a smart aleck comes into the museum next to you and starts talking knowledgeably about the way the painting is constructed in ways that are not arcane, but actually begin to make sense to you if you pay attention to what that person is saying. So I think that's what Wilson did. I think Wilson was extremely important, our first modern president, because he defines the threats that the United States is going to be facing over the course of the next 75 years. And those kinds of ideas had been making the rounds, to be sure, but it's Wilson who manages to synthesize them and put them together in a convincing way that has resonance with people, that makes events understandable. And that is very much, I think, a great work of political art.
The Unfinished Nation is a 52-part American history series. For more information about this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online at www.intelecom.org.